Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am one of the lead faculty within the Pelvic Health Division within the Institute of Clinical Excellence. We have two courses in our repertoire. We have our 8-week online pregnancy and postpartum course, which we just started this week. Our next course is in July, mid-July. And then we have our 2-day live course rather, that we just had a course in Grand Rapids, Michigan that looked amazing. Alexis was leading us in Michigan. And our next course is in June in Hendersonville. If you are interested in jumping in to learn the internal assessment and bridging that into fitness, I encourage you to take a look at those live options on the website. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, the last time I was on the podcast for pelvic, we did a load and lengthen series for the abdominal canister. So the abdominal wall in particular, where we really talked about how we need to expand upon the way that we conceptualize rehab and stop doing everything in neutral, because that is just not the way we live our life. We can start there, right? With rib cage pinned over pelvis. But for our active individuals, for our moms, they're going to have to be strong in extension and in flexion. And that is true for individuals after a C-section, after a vaginal delivery, and those who are just living their life. In part 2, I want to start to think about these concepts when it comes to our pelvic floor. When we really boil down rehab, when we really try and say, like, what is the one thing that we can hold true when it comes to rehab in general, is that our body needs to be strong enough to handle what we're asking it to do. And if it isn't, it breaks down. We often conceptualize this with respect to pain in the orthopedic setting, but in the pelvic setting, yes, pain can be one of those contributing factors. But also what we see is that when our pelvic floor isn't strong enough to handle what we're asking it to do, it can be leaking. That is the output or the signal that our body is sending. This is almost universally true with everything we deal with in orthopedics. When we think, however, about the range of motion considerations, is that our body needs to be able to move in a range of motion that is required for activities of daily living. And if it doesn't, we have to push a lot harder, or it makes our life a lot more challenging, or we have to compensate in some ways. And that's where you've seen a lot of rehab professionals, rightfully so, be working on a person's functional mobility, whether that's joint mobilizations or soft tissue work, to try and get the range of motion required in the need to do stairs, in the hip to squat down to get onto a toilet, in order for individuals to have a much smoother movement pattern and to prevent a bunch of compensatory mechanisms from happening. We see this in the pelvic floor as well. So we're going to break down these two things. Your body needs to be strong enough to handle what you're asking it to do. Your joints need to be able to move through the range of motion that's required. If not, they are going to compensate. Let's talk about the strength part first. So this is the load part of load and lengthen. When we think about incontinence and we think about early postpartum rehab, almost universally, there is going to be an aspect of we are not strong enough syndrome, right? And when we are working with active individuals, they are putting much more demand on their bodies, including their pelvic floor, that we are going to have to prepare them for. In that way, we need to load them. And while we start with pelvic floor muscle training, where we really think when individuals are coming to see us with stress incontinence and weakness is an underlying issue that we've identified, that we are going to isolate that muscle group at first to make sure that the body has awareness and motor control of that group of muscles. But then we're going to translate that into functional tasks. And so when we're conceptualizing pelvic floor rehab, it's really very similar to a lot of our other orthopedic rehab. And what that means is that our body requires load, and our pelvic floor requires load in order to get stronger as well. And so we start with some of these Kegels and pelvic floor muscle training, but then very quickly we bridge this into functional activities. And the cool part about the research that we have now is that we kind of have these ideas of thresholds that individuals are going to have to be able to sustain, whether that's absolute load or instantaneous changes in intra-abdominal pressure, in order for us to have the appropriate force closure, or the amount, I shouldn't say force closure because that can get confusing with pelvic girdle pain, but the amount of strength in the muscles to close sphincters in order for leaking to subside. Let's kind of unpack this a little bit. When we have power lifters who are coming to us who pee with lifting, we can figure out the threshold that they are starting to experience those symptoms. That may be 225 pounds. So there we know where their weakness threshold is, and we can start working on strengthening. And how do we do that? We don't completely eliminate lifting. We take the load down. We teach them how to brace appropriately to make sure they're moving in the right mechanic. That includes their pelvic floor mechanics. We may change the way that they're breathing temporarily to try and prime the pelvic floor to activate a bit more stronger at the right times, at the right moments. And we accumulate volume sub threshold in order to load the body. But in this situation, the pelvic floor is likely the weak point of the core canister. And we accumulate volume sub threshold and then push into those thresholds again. Similar to, we don't dodge away from pain when individuals are experiencing orthopedic injuries. We accumulate volume sub threshold, where our threshold is usually at that 2 to 3 out of 10 pain. We're not trying to be necessarily pain free, but we can be pain managed in those moments. And then we push into further and further thresholds. We're going to do the exact same thing for individuals who are leaking with instantaneous increases in intra-abdominal pressure, like coughing, sneezing, and vomiting, laughing really hard. We can look at what some of those vaginal squeeze pressures are, and really what we could do is get a in clinic periodometer and see if we are hitting those squeeze pressures. But for many of us, we don't have that, nor is it completely necessary. But we just know that the pelvic floor has to be able to sustain that increase in intra-abdominal pressure that happens with those movements. And we know that, coughing or laughing is going to be generally a little bit less intra-abdominal pressure than coughing, and coughing is going to be a little bit less than sneezing. And then we gradually work our way through and make sure that the pelvic floor is strong enough to withstand those types of increases in intra-abdominal pressure. But we cannot just be focusing on the loading part. I would say that we need to do a lot more work on functional loading of the pelvic floor and step away a little bit quicker from isolated loading with respect to Kegels and pelvic floor muscle training in supine. But then the other side of the equation is making sure that we have the lengthen piece, or the range of motion piece, that is required for this muscle group, right? We would never be okay with holding our bicep at 90 and only doing this type of range of motion with our arm. And yet there's individuals who can be in that shortened range of motion with the pelvic floor, and we want to work on some of that lengthening. What can happen when individuals are experiencing incontinence for long periods of time, they feel like they are always trying to do Kegels, is that the pendulum for them can swing, and that hypervigilance and awareness of the pelvic floor can make them have an increase in tone or squeeze of the pelvic floor, where when all of a sudden we do have this increase in intra-abdominal pressure that occurs, we don't have that range of motion to have that contraction to squeeze or kink off those sphincters, and leaking can subside or can occur. In our active individuals, if they are trying to Kegel the entire time that they are running or jumping or doing Pilates or doing yoga, that is a high amount of fatigue that is accumulating across a person's workout, across a person's day. And then what happens is that muscle group hits a fatigue point, And when that increase in interabdominal pressure happens under fatigue, now symptoms are not able to be managed. And in our assessment, what we're going to be figuring out subjectively is, do we have different times of the day, or do we have different situations and circumstances, like aggravating and easing factors that we talk about in a lot of our different conditions within ICE when we're talking about rehab in general? When do those things occur? And for many people, it can be, when the bladder is full, when they are further on in their day, when they've been sick for a couple of days and they've been coughing nonstop, that by the time they're at day 3 of their cold, that their body is just fatigued, and they've been trying so hard to hold their pelvic floor to prevent themselves from having those incontinence episodes, that they end up being unable rather to withstand that increase in pressure anymore, and they start having incontinence issues. When we are talking to individuals who are in more of a flight or fight or flight, higher stress, higher anxiety side of the spectrum, when we are dealing with those individuals, they may have themselves in a more neurologically enhanced state. When we talk about higher tone in the pelvic floor space, I really feel like we're going to be pushing towards this neuro biopsychosocial approach to high tone. And we're really there a lot clinically already. But when it comes to the way that the research is conceptualizing this, I think we're still kind of in this mechanical only type of mindset. And we need to shift gears away from that a little bit. And that can be where we can kind of be holding on really tight. And whether we can, truly be able to appreciate all of that with assessment, the jury's still out on that. But we can see these triggers in our minds when we're going through subjective, that they may be on that higher side of the higher tone or higher heightened awareness of the pelvic floor side of the spectrum. And usually when individuals are not going through the full range of motion of the pelvic floor, or their baseline isn't in a rested state. In our live course, we talk about being able to reach the basement of an A-frame house. And when we're contracting, we're going up to the attic. So this would be where individuals are staying up in the attic versus coming down and being able to have a resting pressure in the basement. These are individuals who more typically tend to have pain as well. And it can be a chicken or the egg. Is it they were holding on too tight and that caused pain? It really doesn't matter. What matters is that when we have those pain presentations on board, we are usually trying to work on a lengthen side of the continuum in order for us to be able to fully holistically treat this individual with some of these issues. And when individuals are in that state, it can be a very vulnerable place when we have, they've been leaking, where they have feelings of lack of recovery postpartum, a feeling of openness. They may have had a diagnosis of prolapse. And when we have some of those conditions, our response can be one of guarding, and one of guarding often means one of contracting. And so when you're trying to encourage individuals to lengthen their pelvic floor and then be strong through those lengthened positions, because when we're in the bottom of a squat, our pelvic floor is in a lengthened position relatively to when we stand up. It is important to know that that may be a very vulnerable space for those individuals, where they are going to feel like maybe they'll leak and have a show of symptoms. Again, that's going to be fine, because we need to work through those symptoms in order for them to improve. It's not a step backwards. It's a working towards a goal where the path is not always linear. And it can have a lot of conversations around what that vulnerability feels like, and that desensitization of the nervous system to some of those symptoms and feelings can be really, really important in this lengthened side of the spectrum. And so when we're really trying to bring this full circle and kind of bring this out back around, when we're thinking about loading, we want to think about it in isolation, but we also want to do that within functional movement, right? That can be coordination, that can be progressive overload, that can be volume accumulation subthreshold, in order to manage symptoms and improve the presentation of incontinence or other pelvic health issues. And then when we're thinking about lengthen, we're thinking about making sure that our pelvic floor, just like any other muscle group, can go through a full range of motion and excursion. And if we think that individuals are in a shortened range of motion, it is an extremely important part of rehab to be able to make sure that the full range of motion is able to be achieved in order for them to be able to live their life under a lower baseline level of fatigue of those muscles in order for them to have longer endurance and reduce symptoms with increased endurance of those muscles. All right. I hope you found that helpful. Let me know if you have any other thoughts and feelings. It's really hard to take really big concepts and there's lots of nuance and there's always going to be, well, this situation or that situation for sure. But this is kind of the framework that we build a lot off of. And we want to then go into the weeds of the nuance after that. So once we have clarity on, the framework that we build our pelvic floor rehab off of, then we can start getting into the weeds of different circumstances. If you are looking for the weeds of research, did you see what I did there? Then please sign up for our newsletter, ppponice.com or news.com newsletter. It is on ptonice.com and it's under the free resources section. This is the last time I'm on this week, so I'm going to take this time to wish a very happy Mother's Day to all of our mamas that are listening to this podcast. I hope that you are spoiled with whatever spoiled means for you and that you are shown all of the love and appreciation that you so deserve on the weekend, but also just all the time. I hope you enjoy that day and that you get to spend time with family. And to the moms that are grieving or moms who are wanting to be moms, just know that I hold space for you as well. And, thinking about you on this weekend, which, is sparks joy in some, but can spark sadness in others. So really thinking about all of my mamas and mamas to be, want to be mamas this weekend. And I hope you all have a wonderful week.